worked like a mule until her hands cracked open. A Lakota chief held them and did not let go. The dog was the first thing I noticed about her. Not her, the dog. A three-legged shepherd mix, yellowish, sitting at the edge of my south pasture fence like it had every right to be there. I was moving fence posts, the ground still half frozen in the shade even though it was late April, and I had a post driver in my hands and sweat running down the back of my neck, and I looked up, and there was this dog watching me work. I said nothing to it. I set the next post and swung. The dog didn't flinch. It took me a while to realize the dog had come from the Hallett place, across the creek. And it took me a while after that to realize there was a woman at the Hallett place now, because Bud Hallett had been dead since January and his family back in Ohio hadn't said a word to me or to anyone in the valley about what would happen to that land. I am going to tell you this the way I remember it, which is not in order. Memory doesn't move in a straight line. It circles. It drops things and comes back for them. 40 years on, I still find pieces of those months I hadn't turned over yet. So if I go sideways sometimes, don't lose me. There's a thread. You'll find it. My name is James Kills Thunder. I go by James. My father was Oglala Lakota. My mother a white woman from Illinois who followed a missionary west and fell in love with the wrong man, meaning my father, who was the best man she ever met and who died of a fever when I was 11. I was raised between two worlds and comfortable in neither, which is a common enough story that I don't dwell on it. I had land in the valley southeast of the Black Hills, 160 acres I'd worked into something real over 15 years of grinding. Cattle mostly, a garden, a well that ran cold and clean, a house that was solid if not beautiful. I was 53 years old that spring. I had been alone for 9 years. My wife Clara died in childbirth, the baby too. That was 1871. I don't talk about it much. I'm talking about it now only because you need to know the shape of a man to understand what a woman walking into his life means. I had gone hard in those 9 years. Not mean. I wasn't cruel or bitter in the way some men get, but I had gone quiet in a way that went past quiet into something else. I stopped expecting things. Stopped wanting them mostly. You do that long enough, wanting feels like a foreign language you used to speak. The dog came back the next day, and the day after. On the 4th day, I walked over to the Hallett place. I went because I thought maybe someone had moved in without knowing the fence line, and I didn't want a dispute later. That was the reason I told myself. I have thought about it since, and I think it was also because a three-legged dog that comes back 4 days in a row is trying to tell you something. And even a man who has gone quiet in his bones knows to listen when something keeps showing up. The Hallett place was in worse shape than I'd expected. Bud hadn't been much for maintenance even when he was alive, and 6 months of winter without anyone to keep the roof and the barn had done damage. A section of fence along the creek was down. The pump handle was off the pump and sitting in the dirt beside it like someone had thrown it there and not come back. The yard was a tangle of old weeds and mud and wood chips from some long-ago splitting that had never been raked up. She was in the middle of it, splitting wood. Not kindling. Full rounds. Big elm rounds, the kind that take 2 men to roll if they're green, and she was splitting them with a maul that was slightly too long for her, and planting each round on a chopping block that was too low. Her form was wrong in 3 places, and I could see it from 20 feet, and I could also see that it didn't matter because she was getting through them anyway. She stopped when she heard me come through the gate, and she didn't smile or speak right away. She looked at me. She was maybe 40, maybe less. It was hard to tell because the outdoor work had put years in her face that weren't really there. Dark hair coming loose from a braid. A canvas coat a size too large, man's coat, gone gray at the elbows, and her hands around the handle of that maul. That was when I first saw her hands. I didn't say anything about them then. It wasn't my place, and I didn't know her, and she was looking at me with an expression that was not unfriendly but was careful, the way you look at something in the yard you're not sure about yet. I told her my name. I told her I had the place across the creek. I said I'd seen her dog. She said his name was Button, and he had a habit of visiting people without permission, and she was sorry if he'd been a nuisance. I said he hadn't been. She told me her name was Nora Hallett. She was Bud's cousin, come out from Michigan after she'd heard he'd died with no one to see to his things. She'd thought she'd come for 2 weeks to sort it and sell it. I asked what changed. She looked out at the land. At the pasture going down to the creek, brown and patchy still, but starting to show the first green underneath. She said she didn't know yet. She said it was a different kind of quiet out here than what she'd been used to. She wasn't sure if it was the good kind or the bad kind. I told her there wasn't much in between. She made a sound that might have been a laugh and turned back to her wood. I should have left. I had fenced to finish. Instead, I said the chopping block was too low and offered to find her a better one from my woodlot. She looked at me the way women look at men who say things like that, measuring whether there's a price attached to the offer. I must have passed because she nodded and said thank you, and I went back across the creek and came back with a wider round that brought the block up to where it needed to be. I said it for her and didn't wait to be thanked, just left. But I thought about those hands driving home. This is the part I circle back to, her hands. They were not soft. They were never soft, I don't think, even before she came out here. She told me later she'd been working since she was 14, laundry and then a cannery and then taking in mending, and her hands had the history of all of that in them. But the 2 months she'd spent at the Hallett place alone before I walked through that gate had done something else to them. The cold and the wet and the wood splitting and the pump work, and whatever else she'd been doing to try to bring that place back to something livable, it had cracked them. The skin at the knuckles and along the first joints of her fingers cracked open in the way that doesn't heal because you can't stop using your hands. Red and split and some of it bleeding just slightly in the deep cracks. I didn't know this yet that first day. I noticed her hands on the mall and thought they were rough, and that was all. But her hands are where this story lives. Come back to them. Keep coming back to them. I didn't go over there again for a week. I'm not sure what I was waiting for. Maybe I was making sure the offer to help wasn't something I'd be trapped in. Maybe I was just slow, the way I'd gotten slow about everything that might matter. What brought me back was the fence line. The section along the creek that was down, it sat on both our properties. Technically half my responsibility. I had the wire and the posts and nothing urgent keeping me from fixing it, and so I loaded the wagon and went over on a Thursday morning without sending word ahead. She was on the roof. The Hallett barn had a bad section of shingles on the south slope, the kind that curls and gaps in the second year after you should have replaced them, and she had gotten herself up there with a bucket of nails and a hatchet and was prying up the bad ones and hammering down the ones that could be saved. She had rope tied around the chimney base and looped through her belt, which was smart. I stood in the yard and watched her for a moment before I said anything. She heard me and looked down. She did not look embarrassed. She said good morning and asked if I could hand up the bucket of replacement shingles from the barn floor. I handed them up, then I climbed up and helped. We worked on that roof for 3 hours and said maybe 40 words the whole time. Some of the 40 were about the shingles. A few were about the weather. She told me she'd never been on a roof before this one, and I told her she was doing fine because she was. She had a steadiness to her. She didn't rush and she didn't waver, and when a shingle split wrong she didn't curse it, just set it aside and picked up another. Coming down, she missed a rung on the ladder and I caught her arm. Her sleeve pushed back and I felt the roughness of her wrist, and I got my first real look at what her hands had become. She saw me looking and pulled her sleeve down and didn't say anything. We fixed the fence line that afternoon. I had the tools and she had the time, and we worked from the creek to the road without splitting the labor up, just both of us doing what needed doing at any given moment, which is the best way to work with another person. When we finished, she brought out bread and cold salt pork, and a jar of the previous tenant's apple preserves, and we ate sitting on the dropped tailgate of my wagon and watched the creek go. She asked me how long I'd been in the valley. I said 15 years. She said the land seemed to know me. She said it like it was a simple observation, not a compliment, and that was what made it land. I asked her what Michigan was like. She said flat and gray, and nothing she was going back to. I drove home that evening and I cooked my supper, and I sat at my table afterward, and I noticed for the first time in a long time that the house was quiet in the bad way. This is the part of the story where I need to go back a little, because there's a thing you have to know about me that isn't flattering. After Clara died, I went into a kind of running, not running away, not exactly. I stayed on the land, I worked it, but I ran from stillness. I kept myself so busy with the work that I didn't have to sit inside my own head for more than a few minutes at a time. Sunrise to past dark, every day, and then too tired for anything but sleep. I thought that was strength, thought I was managing. What I was doing was slowly emptying myself out. By the time that spring came around, I was running on habit and momentum and not much else. I got up because I'd always gotten up. I worked because the work was there. I ate because a body needs fuel. I was present in the way a well-maintained fence is present, serviceable, holding, not alive. There's a reason I'm telling you this. A man in that condition doesn't know he's in it. You don't feel empty when you're empty. Empty feels like normal. You lose the point of comparison. It took someone coming alongside to show me what I'd become, and that showing was not gentle, and it was not immediate. It happened the way bad damage heals, slowly, and sometimes painfully, and with scar tissue. I'm not going to tell you I fell in love with Nora like a man in a dime novel. That's not what happened. What happened was slower and stranger, and more like something growing in rocky ground than anything soft or easy. She came over to my place for the first time on a Tuesday in May. Button came first, as always. I heard him scratch at the door while I was still at the table with my morning coffee, and I let him in, and he turned 3 circles and lay down in front of the stove, which he did every time he came over after that, like it was his spot, which eventually it was. She knocked 10 minutes later. She had a pot covered with a cloth, and she held it out and said she'd made too much stew and could I use it. I could use it, I said so. She handed it over. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked past me into the house with an expression I couldn't entirely read. I asked if she wanted coffee. She said yes and came in. My house was clean but bare. Clara had made it a home and I had kept it clean but replaced nothing in 9 years, and the bare places where her things had been were just bare places now. Walls with lighter rectangles where pictures had hung, a shelf with nothing on it. Nora didn't say anything about it. She sat at the table and took her coffee and looked out the window at the pasture, and we talked about whether the late rains would push the grass enough to bring the cattle numbers up. Before she left, she was looking at the pump, which had been leaking at the joint since March, and she said I should wrap that joint with oiled cloth as a temporary fix until I could get a new washer from town. I told her I knew that. She said, well then, I should do it before the leak got into the floorboards. I had been meaning to. I had not done it because doing it required going to town, and I had let going to town slide the same way I'd let a dozen small things slide. She said this without judgment in her voice, and it still made me feel the neglect clearly. She left and I went out and wrapped the joint. This was the beginning of something I didn't have a word for at the time. I do now. It was being seen, not flattered, not pitied, seen. The way you see a thing clearly because you're looking straight at it without wanting anything from it. Nobody had looked at me that way in 9 years. Through May and into June, we found reasons to be useful to each other that mostly started as practical and turned into something else. I helped her get a new roof section on the house proper because the barn hadn't been the worst of it. I helped her move 2 deadfalls from her pasture that she'd been working around. She brought food over, always having made too much, which was never entirely true, but was a kindness that let us both pretend otherwise. She helped me work a difficult colt I'd taken in for a neighboring rancher, because it turned out she had a way with horses that surprised me, not formal training, just patience, and a particular quality of stillness in her body when she was near something frightened. Button stayed at my place most days. He became so clearly a fixture that I stopped thinking of him as her dog and just thought of him as the dog. I noticed her hands every time I saw her. They weren't healing. The work at the Hallett place was endless, the way that kind of land gets endless when it's been neglected. You fix one thing and 2 more show themselves. You get ahead on one season and behind on the next, and all of it done by 2 hands that never got to rest. By June, the cracks in her skin had gone deeper. She kept them wrapped sometimes, strips of cloth wound around her palms and the first 2 fingers on her right hand. But the wrapping came off for work, and there was always work. I brought it up once early June. I said I had some salve in the barn that was good for deep cracks, a tallow and pine pitch mixture my mother had made, and I still made it the same way. She looked at her hands like she was noticing them for the first time, which was not true but was a kind of performance she put on for modesty, and she said they were fine. I did not push it, but I left the tin of salve on her fence post the next morning with no note. It was gone by afternoon. She never mentioned it. The thing that changed happened on a day in late July. I had been working the east section all week, fencing and doctoring a calf with a bad foot, and I hadn't slept well for 3 nights running, and I was moving slow that morning, slower than I'd noticed. I was coming around the far side of the barn with a bucket of water and I went down. Not a stumble. My legs just quit. One moment I was walking and the next I was on my knees in the dirt and the bucket was on its side and water was going into the ground. I stayed on my knees for a while. I wasn't hurt. My legs were under me. They just didn't seem to want to work. I put one hand in the dirt and tried to push up and couldn't make it go right, and I sat back in the mud and looked at the water spreading in the dirt. I don't know how long I was there. Long enough that the mud went cool. Here is the thing I have to say about that moment because it's the truth. I was not frightened. I should have been. A man of 53 on his knees in the mud unable to stand is a thing that should frighten him. It didn't. What I felt was something closer to flat, like the part of me that was supposed to care about what happened to me had been running on empty for so long that it just stopped. I sat in the mud and I looked at the water in the dirt and I thought, with a clarity that was almost peaceful, that it would be all right if this was it. I am not proud of that. I'm telling it because it's true. It was Button who came around the barn first. He stuck his nose in my face and I pushed him away and he came back. 3-legged, he couldn't exactly pace, but he did a kind of circling that was his version of it, and then he went off toward the creek at a run. Nora came maybe 20 minutes later. She came through the fence gate at the far end of my property, moving fast, Button running that odd loping run ahead of her. She saw me and she didn't call out. She came straight to me and she crouched down in the mud and she looked at me. She said, "Are you hurt?" I said no. She said, "Are you sick?" I said I didn't think so. She put the back of her hand on my forehead the way you do with a child. Her hands were rough and cool. She took my wrist and felt the pulse there, held it for a while, her thumb in the groove of my wrist. Then she sat down in the mud beside me. She didn't say anything right away. She looked at where the water had spread in the dirt, same as me. The 2 of us sitting in the mud beside my tipped-over bucket. She asked me when was the last time I had eaten a real meal. I said yesterday. She said before yesterday. I thought about it. I had a biscuit the day before that, some dried beef the day before that. I had not really been eating. I had not really noticed I hadn't been eating. She got up and helped me up, her shoulder under my arm until I had my feet, and she walked me to the house. She made me sit at the table. She went through my kitchen like she'd been in it 100 times, which she hadn't, and she found what there was, which wasn't much, and she made something out of it. Corn mush with a little fat, and some dried beans she soaked in hot water, and she made me eat all of it while she sat across the table from me and watched to make sure I did. Then she put water on for coffee, and while it heated she said, plainly, without anger or softness, that she'd been watching me for 2 months and I was working myself toward nothing, and she didn't know what the reason was, but she knew the shape of it because she'd done the same thing herself after her husband died, 8 years back. Worked and worked and worked until the work was the only thing keeping the darkness from swallowing her whole. And the problem with that was when the work slowed down, the darkness was still there, and now bigger. She said she wasn't going to tell me what to do. She said she was going to come over here every morning and make sure I ate something. I told her she didn't have to do that. She said she knew she didn't have to. She poured the coffee and set a cup in front of me and sat down and didn't say anything else about it. And we drank coffee in my quiet kitchen and slept in front of the stove. And I didn't know what to do with what she'd said, so I just let it sit there. She came the next morning, and the morning after, and the morning after that. She didn't make a production of it. She'd knock, come in, start something on the stove, and we'd eat, and then she'd go back to her place and her own work, and I'd go to mine. Some mornings we didn't talk much. Some mornings we talked for an hour. She had opinions about things I hadn't thought about in years. About the way land should be read before you planted, about water, about the quality of silence in different seasons, about what it means to stay somewhere until the land lets you in. She had also, I learned, been reading. Bud Hallett's house had shelves of books from some prior owner, a serious collection, and she had been working through them on the long evenings. She'd read about half of them and had thoughts about most. She asked me once about Lakota ways of reading land and weather, about my father's ways, and I told her the things I knew, which were incomplete because I had only had my father until I was 11. She listened to what I told her with her full attention, asked careful questions. It was the way she had of making you feel that what you knew mattered, that what you knew was worth knowing. I started eating meals again. I mean real meals, not just fuel. I started sleeping through the night. Somewhere in August I noticed I was waking up before the alarm, lying in the dark thinking about what the day held, and the feeling wasn't dread. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was something. Orientation, maybe, like a compass finding north. I didn't make the connection to her right away. That's how it works. When you've been in the dark a long time, light doesn't announce itself. It just shows up in the things you can see. Her hands got worse before they got better. August was dry that year, and the pump she had was old and stiff, and the handle required a certain wrenching motion that put particular stress on the heel of the hand. She'd also taken on a second round of fence repair on the north section of the property, and was doing it alone, which was wrong, and I knew she was doing it alone because I hadn't offered and she was too proud to ask. I showed up one morning and helped. We worked for 4 days on that fence. I had better tools and she had the knowledge of where the weak sections ran, and we moved through it in a way that was easy by then, the easy you get from working beside someone often enough that you don't have to talk about who does what, you just do it. On the last day, coming back to the house at evening, she was trying to work the pump and her right hand slipped and she made a sound that was not quite a gasp, just a catch in the throat, and I looked over and the heel of her palm was bleeding properly. Not just cracked, split. She turned away and wrapped her hand in her apron and kept working the pump. I walked over and put my hand over hers on the handle and worked it for her. She let me. I filled both our pails. Then I told her to come inside and she did, and I went to the shelf where I'd restocked the salve tin and brought it to the table. She sat down and put her hand flat on the table. The hands I was looking at were remarkable in the way that hard-used things are remarkable. There is an honesty to that kind of wear. Her skin was the color of old leather at the knuckles, paler in the palm, cracked along every joint where she'd bent them 10,000 times. The split on the heel was clean-edged, the way skin splits when it's dry and the tension finally wins. I opened the salve tin. I took her right hand in both of mine. She went very still. I have large hands, my father's hands. They'd known ropes and fence wire and frozen ground and the rough necks of cattle for 40 years, and they weren't gentle things. But I worked the salve in slowly, along the knuckles into the deep cracks, gentle in the split at the heel. I felt her trying to decide whether to pull away. I felt the moment she decided not to. She didn't look at me, she looked at our hands, hers wrapped in mine, mine moving slowly across hers. I did the right hand and then the left. When I was done, I held both her hands in mine, and I didn't let go right away. She looked up. There is no good way to describe what passed between us in that moment without making it smaller than it was. I am not a man who has the words for certain things. What I will tell you is that she looked at me without any shield up, without the careful expression she kept on for the world. She looked at me the way you look at something you have been waiting to find and weren't sure you were going to find, and she didn't look away. She said my name. Just my name, James, the way you say a word you've been thinking for a long time. I am 53 years old. I have sat a horse in a lightning storm and held a dying man's hand and carried my wife out of a burning house one winter and set fence posts in February ground and done 100 things that required steadiness. None of it ever required the kind of steadiness that moment required. To hold still, to let it be true. I did not let go of her hands. There is more to tell, there is always more. The autumn and the hard winter after. There was a man named Gartley who had been watching the Hallett property since Bud died, assuming it would come to market, and when he understood it wasn't coming to market, he came around with his foreman and tried to make Nora feel like staying was a mistake. I was there the second time he came. I won't say much about that conversation, except that Gartley was a man accustomed to size and money doing his talking, and he was not accustomed to a man who simply didn't move. When there is nothing left in you that can be threatened, you find out you are less afraid than you thought. He did not come a third time. There was the hard winter, her cattle got through it, mine got through it, we fed both herds from both stores. There was the matter of the valley. I want to say something about that because it's part of the story. This was not a friendly valley to someone who looked like me. I had earned my place here the way I earned most things, by showing up every day and doing the work, and not asking for what the valley wasn't ready to give. And over 15 years I had accumulated a kind of respect that was grudging but real. People knew what I was worth. They did not always know what to call me or how to place me. A man who was half Lakota and half white and belonged fully to neither world. And there were men in this valley who were polite to my face and said other things when I wasn't there. When Nora and I began to spend time together, some of those men said things. She told me about it one evening in October. Said 2 women at the general store had made remarks about her judgment and her choices, and a man whose name I knew had stopped her on the road to tell her she might want to think carefully about her reputation. She told me this in the same flat voice she used to describe weather or fence conditions. I asked her what she had said to the man on the road. She said she had told him she would think carefully about whatever she chose to think carefully about, and he could think carefully about minding his own affairs. She said it like it was already settled and behind her, which it was. It was not behind me so easily, because I had spent 15 years absorbing those remarks in one form or another, and each one still left a mark. But she didn't require me to explain that. She could see it. She just sat with me in it without making me defend anything, or explain anything, or justify myself. That was the thing about her. She never asked me to be different than I was. She never implied I should smooth anything over or be more convenient for anyone. She saw me as I was and she thought that was fine, more than fine. You do not know what that means until someone does it for you, and then you cannot believe you went so long without it. There was a Sunday in December when she came over with biscuits, and we sat at my table all afternoon without talking much at all, and the fire in the stove made the house warm, and Button was asleep on his side on the floor, and the snow came outside the window, and the house felt like a different house than it had been, like it had come back to itself. There was the morning she found me out at Clara's grave, which is at the far corner of my east pasture under a cottonwood. I went there sometimes. I went there less than I used to. She found me there, and she came and stood beside me and didn't say anything, didn't ask anything, just stood. I told her a little about Clara, not much, the part I could say out loud. She said Clara had made a good man. She said it like a fact, not a consolation. I had not heard myself described as a good man in a long time. I had not been sure I still was. I want to tell you about a particular night, early February, the coldest stretch of the year. I was in my barn at 2 in the morning with a cow who was calving wrong, and I'd been in there for 3 hours, and the calf was stuck and I was losing ground. My hands were bloody up to the elbows, and I was cold, and I was out of the kind of energy that comes from having eaten and slept right, which I had not done in 2 days because the cow had been struggling that long. The barn door opened, and there was Nora. She had on her coat over her nightgown, boots unlaced, her braid coming loose. She'd seen the lantern in the barn from her window. She didn't ask what needed doing. She looked at the situation and pulled off her coat and hung it on the post and rolled up her sleeves. What happened after that is not a story about romance. It is a story about 2 people working in a cold barn for 2 hours, until a wet and outraged calf was in the world and breathing, its mother cleaning it, both of them alive. Nora's hands were bloody, and she was shaking a little from cold, and the particular depletion that comes from that kind of effort. And I was sitting back against the barn wall on the straw with my legs out in front of me because I had nothing left. She sat down beside me. Neither of us spoke for a while. The cow and calf were doing what they needed to do. The lantern made its small circle of warm light in the cold barn. Outside, the wind. She leaned her head against my shoulder. I did not move. I stayed very still. Then I put my arm around her. She was cold, and she smelled like hay and blood, and that faint wood smoke smell she always had, and she was shaking a little, and I held her and she went still. I felt the weight of her. The particular real weight of another person against your side when you have not felt that in a long time. 9 years. I had forgotten what it was like to hold someone. I had forgotten how particular it was, how specific a person feels, not bodies in the abstract, but this person, her shoulder and her arm and the top of her head against my jaw, the exact weight and warmth of her. I did not say anything. She didn't say anything. We sat in that barn until the shaking stopped, both of ours, and the calf stood for the first time, its legs ridiculous and perfect, and the cow made a low rumble of satisfaction. And then we went inside and she made coffee, and we drank it at the table as the sky outside started to go from black to gray. The question I've been asked over the years by men who have heard a version of this story is whether I knew then. Whether in that barn, sitting on that straw with her head on my shoulder, I knew what this was. I knew. I think I'd known for a while. But knowing and saying are not the same thing, not for me, not for a man who has learned to live with knowing things quietly inside himself. What changed was what she said. It was a week after the barn night. We were at my table in the morning, as had become routine by then, her coffee and mine and Button on the floor, the ordinary comfortable silence of 2 people who don't need to fill space. She said, without looking up from her cup, that she had been thinking. I said I was listening. She said she had been alone a long time. She said she had come to terms with being alone, the same way you come to terms with a landscape you didn't choose and then discover you've grown to fit. She said she had thought she would spend the rest of her life in that accommodation. She said she had changed her mind. She looked up. She said she wanted to stay. Not at the Hallett place. She was done calling it that anyway because it wasn't Bud's place anymore, it was her place. She meant she wanted to stay here. In the valley, near me. She said she wanted more mornings at this table. She said, and this is the part I am going to carry until I can't carry anything. She said she had watched me for 8 months, and she knew what kind of man I was. She said she knew about the grave at the cottonwood and the hard years, and the way I kept the land like a man who loves something he doesn't know how to say he loves. She said she had known men in her life, and she had not known one like me. She said she was not asking me to be anything I wasn't. She was asking if what she was feeling was something I felt too. I looked at her across that table. This woman who had come into my life at the far end of my useful years and had, without announcement, brought me back from wherever I had been going. This woman whose hands were scarred from the work of keeping herself alive, and who had stood in my barn at 2 in the morning without being asked, and had sat beside me on the straw and had not asked for anything from me, just sat. I told her yes. I told her it was. She reached across the table and put her hand on top of mine. Her hand was rough and warm, and the heel of it was still marked from the split that had taken so long to heal. I turned my hand over and held hers. Neither of us said anything more. There wasn't anything more to say. The coffee cooled and Button snored, and outside the window the valley was in the pale winter light that comes before the real morning, and I thought that this was what it felt like to be someone someone wanted. I had not thought I would feel it again. We married in the spring. No ceremony to speak of. The justice of the peace in town, 2 witnesses from neighboring farms, a meal after at my house that Nora cooked most of and I helped with, which was how we did everything. There are things I want to tell you about those years that are harder to fit into a telling. The way she learned the land. Not quickly, because the land doesn't give itself quickly, but thoroughly, the way she did everything. She could read weather by the end of the second winter, not just the signs I showed her but the ones she figured out herself, the particular behavior of the creek before a hard frost, the way a certain kind of cloud sat on the ridge. The cattle got used to her, which says something, because cattle are skeptical animals. The difficult colt we'd worked in that first spring grew into a horse that would let only 2 people handle him easily, her and me. The way she rebuilt the Hallett place, her place, from the inside out, because she was not going to fold it into mine, she was going to have her own thing that she brought into what we had. She had opinions about this, and I respected them because they were right. She kept her land and I kept mine, and we worked both together, which made us more than either of us could have been separately. In the 3rd year, we took the fence out between the south sections and ran the land as one, which is what it had wanted to be all along. The way she changed my house, not all at once. Slowly, a curtain. A picture she'd done herself, charcoal on paper, of the creek in winter, a quilt on the bed, small things that filled the bare places on the walls and the shelves, and I watched it happen and I felt it happen, the house becoming itself again. Button died in our 3rd year together, old age, in front of the stove in my kitchen, which was the right place for him to go. She held him at the end and I sat beside her, and she did not apologize for crying. We buried him by the creek, where the grass was good. I am not the man I was when that 3-legged dog first sat at my fence. I don't know exactly what I was then. Empty, I said earlier, but that's not quite right. I was present but pointed nowhere. I was alive but not living for anything. I had been that way long enough that I thought it was my nature, thought the stillness inside me was a quality and not a wound. It was a wound. What Nora saw, what she kept seeing, for 8 months before I understood she was doing it, was through the wound. She saw the man on the other side of it. She saw the man who built something real on 160 acres and kept it for 15 years and treated his cattle with care and split fence posts in February because the fence needed splitting, and held a dying calf in a cold barn at midnight because the calf needed holding. She saw competence and steadiness, and a will that bent under grief but hadn't broken. She chose that man. I did not feel chosen, not right away. The choosing came into me slowly, the way warmth comes into cold ground in early spring. You don't feel it until one morning you reach down and the earth isn't frozen anymore. One morning I reached down and I wasn't. I am writing this in my kitchen, which is her kitchen, which is ours. It's early morning. The window over the table shows the pasture and the creek, and beyond it the ridge, and the light on the ridge is the first light, the thin gold that comes before the full sunrise. I have been up a while. I don't sleep late anymore, not in any season, because the morning is the best part and I don't want to miss it. Nora is still asleep. I will go in a little while and wake her, and she will say something that is either sharp or funny, which are the same thing with her in the early morning, and we will have coffee here at this table, and watch the sun come up over the ridge. Her hands are different now. Not soft, she'll never be soft-handed, neither of us will. The work is what it is and always will be. But they healed over time, and they are kept now with the tallow salve that I still make from my mother's recipe, and she uses it every night before bed, a habit that started as something I encouraged and became her own. I think about those hands sometimes. The way they were when I first saw them on that mall, rough and capable, and already showing the cost of what she was carrying alone. The way they looked the evening I took them in mine at the table and worked the salve in. The way she had of reaching across a table and putting her hand on top of mine, just that, just the weight of it, the plain, uncomplicated statement it made. She held me with those hands, that's the whole of it. She held me and she didn't let go, and I stopped being a man pointed nowhere, and started being a man with something to be pointed toward. It sounds simple. It is not simple. Nothing real is simple. But sometimes when you are trying to explain a thing that happened to you, the simplest true statement is the one that matters. She held my hands, I held hers back, neither of us let go. The light is gold now on the ridge. The pasture is coming green this year, better than last. The creek is running well. I'm going to wake my wife.